Good morning and welcome to week 6 of the CMA Studio Summer Session. My name is Joyce Beyer and I'm excited to be here this morning to give you the inside scoop on some of the music being played by the Bellin Quartet this week. We have a lesson. Be sure to stick around after the lesson because I'm going to give you some information on how you could win free tickets to an upcoming concert. And if you have any questions as we're going along, stick them in the comment section. I'll get to them as soon as I can. You can also tag people there if you think there's someone that would love to watch along. If you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get to the lesson.
All right, week 6, time to start with our goals. So by the end of the day, goal number 1, I want you to be able to say, I can describe some techniques used by string players when they're playing string instruments. Number 2, I can compare and contrast composers Bach and Smetana. You might know some of these things already, especially if you're a string player. Some of the things might be brand new to you, or maybe you just want a little more detail about them. Wherever you are, that's okay. Hopefully you learned something new. So first, before we talk about some of these techniques, let's review the string family. There are a lot of instruments that use strings in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to specifically talk about some techniques used by the bowed string family. So we're talking about the violin, the viola, the cello, those of us who use this thing right here to make our strings vibrate. And the basic way our instruments work, for those of you who don't know, we have a hollow box of wood with strings over it. The strings vibrate and they are amplified by the hollow box of wood. That is the abbreviated version, spark notes of how to make a string instrument. But we use some techniques to kind of amplify our sound or create different kinds of sound. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a really popular one. It's called vibrato. Core of that word is vibrate, which is what our strings do anyway. But when we use vibrato, essentially what we're trying to do is make our strings vibrate even more. Now, I put how to do this, and I want to recognize that this is an oversimplification. Essentially, when we're trying to do vibrato, the end goal is something like this. So we're moving our hand. When we're first working on vibrato, though, it really is like a whole arm sort of thing, but we get our finger to stick in one spot so that when we're moving our hand, it just amplifies the amount of vibrations as opposed to changing the pitch. So if I were to play this note without vibrato, there's nothing wrong with it. It's still a nice note, but by adding vibrato, we just make it sound a little bit more robust. And the cool thing about vibrato is there's not just one type. So I tend to use one where my pivot point is more so for my wrist. This is called like a hand or a wrist vibrato. There are people you'll see that do more of an arm vibrato where their whole arm moves. But beyond how you do it, there's also different speeds. Depending on the type of music that you want to have played or just the mood, I can change my speed and it actually changes how the note sounds. So if I want a nice big wide or really intense or like just a nice little shimmer, all of those things are kind of things that we do to change our sound to kind of blend in depending on what we want from the music. So that's vibrato. You see musicians doing it all the time. If you ever go to a concert with a bunch of string players, pretty much everyone's going to be using vibrato at some point, but that changes a little bit based on music. The next technique we're going to talk about is a trill. And I think that some people, especially when they're first learning about these techniques, they think a trill and a vibrato is the same, but a trill actually has to do with using a different note. So instead of like playing just a note, we're actually going to add another note and go back and forth between those two notes. So a trill is something, it's essentially just to like add flair, add pizzazz, sparkle. And it's in this greater family of things that we call ornaments. They're literally decorations to notes. So a lot of music will add a trill, especially to like a longer note or an important note, because they want to make that note more important in the context of all of the notes that are being played. Like I said, when playing this, you're literally switching between two notes, and we almost always trill to the note above. So if it was a printed note that said like F sharp, I would trill between that F sharp to the note above it. And then there are other things you can do with that trill where we add little turns to it. And that all depends on what you're playing. But that's a pretty common thing that you'll hear. Sometimes you'll even hear a whole string orchestra just doing like trills for a really long time. Again, sound effect, something that is different than just the printed note. Okay, we talked about vibrato, we talked about trill. Time to go to tremolo. The first two things we talked about all had to do with your left hand and what things that we do with our left hand to change the sound. Tremolo is something that we do with our bow. I think of it as something that just kind of adds shimmer. It adds shimmer to a note, makes it ring in a different way. So instead of holding a note, we lightly shake our bow. You can do tremolo in different parts of the bow. I will say probably the most common type of tremolo is something out here. Because again, it's more of that shimmery sort of sound. But you can definitely do that if you want something really intense, depending on the type of music, depending on the composer and what was wanted. That's something that you can do. The important thing is it's happening with the bow, and it's happening because you're nice and flexible here and you're able to move this really quickly. If you're not flexible and you don't have a good bow hold, sometimes people at first will try to do this and move their whole arm, but you can't keep up with that. And also, even doing it that amount, that was painful. I need to stretch out because it's just too much tension. So going on to the last of the techniques I'm going to talk about, this is called a harmonic. If I wanted to, I could probably spend a lot of time talking about harmonics and how they work. I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of like science that goes into it that I'm going to gloss over for today. But basically the goal of a harmonic is to get a higher pitch sound that kind of has like a whistle sound to it. It's definitely a different kind of sound. We accomplish this by, instead of firmly pressing down the string, I'm really just lightly touching. So my string actually isn't going down all the way. And essentially I'm interrupting the like frequencies and creating a higher pitch of sound. You'll hear this a lot of times, sometimes just with like a nice high sound that gets held for a really long time. But there are people who will write things that are like whole songs that involve different types of harmonics. The big thing about a harmonic is in addition to touching lightly, you have to make sure your bow is doing the right thing, and you usually have to use a faster bow. So you might have heard, like when I first started to play that, I had a little wobble in my sound. And it was because my bow was going too slow. If I move my bow faster, the harmonic has an easier time coming out. They're hard to control sometimes, but one thing that's cool about them, if your finger's in the right spot and your bow is moving quickly, they work pretty well. And like I said, it's a very cool sound, and a sound that you're actually going to hear in the music being played this week by the Bellin Quartet. So we talked about goal number one, some of the techniques, by no means all of the techniques, just some very popular ones that are used by string players. Time to go on to goal number two, which is talking about our composers. So let's review. A composer, in case you don't know, is someone who writes music. They compose music. And we talk about these composers because even though they lived a long time ago, knowing a little bit more about them, where they came from, what they were like, kind of informs us more about what their music is like. Also, I think it makes the music more interesting. If you know interesting facts about a person, I think it just makes it more fun to listen to the things that they created. If it's just a name of a person you've never met, I don't know, it's not as interesting for me. So I like learning about them, and I hope you do too. First person we're going to talk about, Johann Sebastian Bach. This is someone that, if you've been listening to the series, you've heard about before. Probably one of the most famous composers that has ever lived. He was born in 1685, died in 1750. From Germany, lived in Germany, and he composed during the Baroque era and was so important for that era that when he died, that era ended. And when we talk about things that you would hear in Baroque music, actually something that's really popular is something called an ornament, which is a trill, essentially. A trill is a type of ornament. You will hear a ton of trills in a lot of Bach's music because that was a way that people could add flair to the music that they were playing that was really appropriate for the way that the instruments were back there then. So that's part of why we talked about some of these techniques. You hear them in all of the music that's being played, but specifically in Baroque, we hear that kind of ornamentation. That's something that Baroque music is really known for. Going on to learn a little more about Bach, he came from a very big family. And apparently his parents died when he was 10, and he was actually raised by his brother. His dad taught him violin. His brother is the person who taught him organ. And he went on to, in addition to composing, he spent a lot of time working in churches as organist and composing for the congregations that were there. Very important man, someone you should definitely know as you're learning about music. But I'm really excited about this second composer. His name is Bedřich Smetana. He, very different from Bach. He was born in a different area of the world, what is now the Czech Republic. It has formerly been Czechoslovakia. And when Smetana was there, is probably more so referred to as Bohemia. That area of the world is one of those parts where the borders have changed a lot, depending on wars, who lived there, the cultures. He is a very important person to this country. He was one of the very first who became popular there, and he wrote in the era that we consider romantic music. So Smetana is someone that we would call a Bohemian nationalist composer, and we use this term nationalist composer a lot when talking about composers, and is basically someone who was very deeply proud of their heritage and composed music that used folk tunes from where they grew up and just exemplified, portrayed their culture really well. So he was known for doing that with his compositions. He also helped create the Czech National School of Music, and he helped start the Czech National Opera. And he wrote a lot of different pieces of music, but he's known for writing operas too that were then premiered at the Czech National Opera. He also, going back to the nationalist composer thing, he wrote things not only that used folk tunes, but were supposed to kind of give you the image of his homeland. And they told stories. And this term that we use for that is called programmatic music. So it wasn't just music that was, this is a pretty piece of music, enjoy it for the fact that it's a pretty piece of music. He wrote music that was supposed to make you think about something or kind of had a backstory to it, which I think sometimes helps a lot when you're listening to, especially a big piece of music, to know what it's supposed to be about, to kind of have that image in your head. He was really good at this. And a great example of that is actually the piece that you're going to hear this week that the Bellin Quartet is playing, and that is his quartet called From My Life. And he wrote this programmatic piece that was literally supposed to kind of portray his life and the things that he went through. So obviously he was very proud of his culture and his heritage. He also had some kind of traumatic things that happened to him. A lot of loved ones died. He is another composer like Beethoven, which we talked about before. He lost his hearing. And especially for someone who their whole world is music, to lose your hearing and your ability to hear the things that you identify as being a very important part of yourself, that can be a really big blow. And so this piece, the different movements kind of represent different things that happened. Movement 1 is this very cool opening, starts on the viola, and it's very dramatic. It starts off with this huge dramatic entrance, and he said that it was something that's supposed to kind of foreshadow, tell you that in the future something bad is going to happen. And something that happens later on in that piece is we hear this harmonic, which we talked about. You'll hear this high-pitched ringing whistling. And apparently this high-pitched ringing whistling was actually what Smetana started to hear when he was losing his hearing. He would hear this really high-pitched sound instead of being able to clearly hear what was going on around him. So he incorporated that in his music because that's what happened in his life. Movement number 2 is a polka, which is a type of dance. Composers use dances all the time as a form to build their music around. And a polka is especially important to him because where he was from, a polka was kind of a traditional dance. It's fun. It's not as proper as some other dances would be. This is like a good old, like down home sort of barn dance, for lack of a better term, as opposed to, you see the very like proper types of waltzes that also would have been popular around the time. A polka is very different, but very much from his homeland. And that one's a little bit more fun because he did have great memories of his life, even though these terrible things were happening. Movement 3 is gorgeous. And apparently it was written as kind of like a love song for his wife. So it's really, really pretty. Lots of beautiful things happen. And then movement 4 kind of ties everything together. So it starts off happy and kind of hopeful, but it's interrupted again by that high-pitched harmonic, which is telling you that like, oh, his hearing's going. He's realizing that he can no longer hear things. And then we start to hear kind of echoes of the things that happened in previous movements. I think this piece is very cool. It absolutely tells a story, and knowing the reasoning behind things, I think makes it more powerful. Sure, you can absolutely just listen to it and say like, objectively, that was a cool piece of music. I liked this, I didn't like this. But to know that, especially that high-pitched noise, that's him realizing that he can't hear anymore. I think that makes those moments even more powerful than if you just heard it on its own. So we talked about Bach, we talked about Smetana. Let's talk a little bit more about how we're going to compare those pieces. So I told you a lot about the From My Life quartet. Comparing that to the Bach piece is the air from his orchestral suite. And if you've been paying attention throughout the season, this is actually the same orchestral suite that we've heard other movements from. We heard the Gigue from it on week 1. This air is really famous. It's also known as air on the G string. And I don't want to say it's more simple, because I feel like sometimes we hear the word simple and we think that it's easy or it's not as cool. There's not quite as much going on though. Like, it's a Baroque piece of music. So we have this beautiful piece, this beautiful melody line that you're going to hear played, and it'll have some ornaments like little trills that you heard. And it's just accompanied by the other instruments. Whereas when we go to the From My Life quartet, it's a lot more intense. And every single member of that quartet has a really important role at some time. Everyone gets the melody at some point. There's just a lot that's going on, and it tells a very clear story, which I think has that drama, it has that passion that we consider to be very much like what happened in Romantic music as opposed to what happened in Baroque music. So 2 very different pieces. The From My Life quartet is longer and it has multiple movements, but I think it's really fun to listen to, and I hope you like it. All right, we talked about a lot. Let's go back, review our goals. Goal number 1, I can describe some techniques used by string players when they're playing. We talked about that. We talked about like vibrato, trills, tremolos, and harmonics, which are all pretty popular ways of changing the way a string player plays to either enhance the sound or create a different version of the sound. And you'll hear that in a lot of different types of music for different reasons. Number 2, compare and contrast Bach and Smetana. They were very different. They lived at completely different times. Even though they were both from Europe, they had different homelands, and I think that very much influenced the type of music that they played. So hopefully you learned something new today. Thanks so much for watching. See you next week.
Okay, so as I promised, you have the opportunity to get free tickets to an upcoming concert this fall. All you have to do is go to our website, civicmusic.org, click on education, and you'll find a link where you can download an activity to do while you listen to the concert tomorrow. If you do this activity, make sure you let us know. You can take a picture, send it to info@civicmusic.org, and we will put you in the contest to win some free tickets. Now, I appreciate that you've been here, but even more importantly, I want you to make sure to get to the concert tomorrow, 6 p.m. The same way you watch this, you can watch the Bellin Quartet perform some really great music. So I hope to see you there.